We're now ready to grade, and one last thing to be aware of is how the controls react. Normally they react based on the color space you set for the timeline. However, there's a second way you can work with HDR, and that's to apply a special HDR mode to the node you're working with. Before we apply that special mode, let's take a look at how it currently works. For example, if I move the gain wheel, the values all move down or up, and everything moves equally. There's a linear transformation. Now let's try the special HDR mode. I'll reset this, and as a good habit, I'll add a serial node to which I can add the grading. I'll press Alt-S. I'll go to that node, right mouse button click, and toggle the special HDR mode. You can do this per node. I'll turn that on. You'll see the symbol there. And now watch what happens when I move the gain wheel. Move it down or move it up. The values move in a non-linear fashion, so it's more appropriate for the logarithmic space of HDR. In other words, the highlights move more quickly than the midtones, and the midtones move more quickly than the shadows. So that's a big difference with the gain wheel. Now with some of the wheels, you'll see less of a difference. So lift, gamma, and offset pretty much work as you would expect. If you were to use the log wheels, well, they're already in logarithmic space, so again, not much difference there. However, if you use the curves control, once again, you'll see a big difference. So let me reset the primaries. Put a point in near the top of the curve, near the highlights, and I'll move it straight up or straight down. You can see that the highlight area compresses around where that point is in terms of value. The point falls somewhere around here, so the higher values move down and the lower values move up, but only in this area. Now if I turn off the HDR mode, there'll be a big difference. Straight down or straight up, but almost the entire set of values moves as you change the curve. Now whether you use the HDR mode or not is up to you. I suggest experimenting with the controls with it off and on and see which way you like best. If you do want to use the mode, I suggest applying it at the very beginning before you start the grade. I want to reset my curve and toggle it back on. I mentioned earlier how sometimes colorists work with a nit limit, and this is useful when outputting to a particular platform. For example, maybe a project is targeted for the average consumer TV set, and so you might set a nit limit of, say, 1000. You can do that through the project settings. If I go back to color management, I can change the output color space to one of the last options, which is a set of ST2084 options with nit limits. So here I can pick a 1000 nit limit and click Save. You'll see that no value is permitted to go above 1000. Now it looks like everything above 1000 was cut off and thrown away, but in fact the variation is still there, it's just collapsed. I can get that back though if I go back to my log wheels and adjust the highlights and find that variation once again. As we also discussed earlier, the viewer is not an accurate representation of what's being put out to the HDR monitor. There are a couple steps you can take to make this viewer a little bit more useful. The first is to apply a 3D viewer LUT. Let's give that a try. Back to the project settings, scroll down into the Lookup Table section, and here's a 3D Color Viewer Lookup Table menu. Towards the bottom of the list, you'll see a section that says HDR. So you'll have an HDR with a nit limit converted to a particular gamma, such as gamma 2.4. So here I'll select 1000 nits to gamma 2.4, which would be the same as Rec 709. Click Save. Once it's applied, the view looks a bit scary. There's a lot of contrast, and big portions of the frame are blown out to pure white. Well, what's going on there? Well, anything that falls between 0 and 100 nits is properly exposed, while anything above 100 nits is overexposed and it appears pure white. And that's because the nit limit of SDR is 100 nits. Now it looks like everything from 100 to 1000 is equally bright. That's not actually true. And the second trick you can apply here is to use the RGB readout. In order to do that, go find your qualifier here through this left menu. right mouse button click in your viewer and choose Show Picker RGB Value. Once you apply this, you'll see it each time you return to the viewer while Resolve is open. As you run your qualifier over the white areas, you'll see they're not equal in value, and also they never get to 255. Now this is using an 8-bit scale, 0 to 255, with 255 being pure white. What's happening here though is that 0 to 10,000 nit range is being remapped to the 0 to 255 8-bit range. Because we have a 1000 nit limit, nothing gets above the equivalent in 8-bit, which is roughly 191. Now there is a difference here. The light here is 191, yet her blouse is around 166 or so. And that means that the light bulbs are up here at the top of the limit, yet her blouse is around here. Still above 100, so it appears white. So if you were to look at this on the HDR monitor, you would see variation between the blouse and the light bulbs and the wall and parts of this chip chart and so on, even though we only have a 1000 nit limit. Let's go ahead and take the limit off and see what happens. One thing to note is, just by taking off the limit, nothing changes in terms of the values. If you want the values to go back into that full range, you have to adjust the grading. So for example, if I just reset my highlight, it pops back. Now if I read with my qualifier, the brightest parts are indeed up at 255 because they're up here at the very top. And her blouse is around 188, somewhere in this area. Now as an experiment, we could try to get this to look good in SDR space while maintaining the brightest highlights for HDR. Now there are methods of creating the HDR and SDR grade. There are various workflows and tools we can use, and we'll talk about those later. So I did want to achieve that where it looks mostly good here except for the highlights. I would have to push most of the frame down below the 100 nit threshold. Let's give that a try. I'm going to bend my curve down so most of it moves down here below 100 nits. So now her blouse is no longer as badly overexposed. Most of the frame looks okay, except for the lights, which you'd expect, because they're above 100, running upwards of 10,000. But again, that's just a demonstration of how that might work. If we want to do a HDR and SDR grade, we'll talk about how to do it properly in a later video. For now, I'm going to undo this. And I'll turn off my 3D viewer LUT. So obviously the 3D viewer LUT has a limited usefulness, but can be a way to peer into the values to see what's going on, or give you a way to temporarily check out the project, perhaps when you're away from HDR monitor, like on a laptop. In that case, I'll turn this off, and then we'll think about how to grade this to make it more aesthetic. So what are the goals of HDR grading as compared to SDR grading? Well, the goals are pretty much the same. To create a technically appropriate and aesthetically pleasing output that fits the project. So that generally involves many of the same steps. Adjusting the color balance, adjusting the contrast, making sure the skin tones look good, directing the viewer's eye to a certain part of the screen, and using other tools such as power windows. So I'll apply a quick grade here. Feel free to work on your grade longer. We'll assume the result looks good on the HDR display hooked to the system. Now, to give myself a bit of a limit, I'm going to reapply a nit maximum. Again, this is a common way to work, as very few televisions or monitors can get to the full nit range. This time I'm going to go for a higher nit limit, 4000. The first thing I'll do is try to re-expand my highlights, which are compressed up here at the top of the limit. I'll start with the gain control in the primaries. So now I've regained some of my lost detail up here, although again we can't really see it here on the screen unless we read the values. Next I'll try to insert some contrast by using the curve. And then I can consider the saturation. I think maybe it's a bit high. And then I can address perhaps the overall color balance. It's very pink here, and in particular the shadow area. So there I can switch over to my primary bars and perhaps adjust the red gamma to alter the balance. Now, if I want to do this properly, I'd probably separate out her skin with a power window so she doesn't change color too much. But again, this is just a quick grade. Back to the curve to adjust the contrast. And recheck my highlights one more time. And here I'm letting the highlights go all the way up to the maximum of 4,000. All right, so there's a quick grade. Here's before, pinker, brighter, less contrast. Here's after, a bit darker, more green-blue in the shadow areas, a bit more contrast. Now, how would this differ if we were grading a log shot within this HDR environment? We'll take a look at that in the next video. If you'd like to take a look at this project in its current state, it's saved out as HDR grade.drp.